Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 127 of the Forge of Freedom. Today for the show, I've got an article to share with you by Lawrence Reed, and the article is called "The Root of Today's Worldwide Education Problem is Staring Us in the Face. From Israel to America and lots of places in between, government schools are failing. This should not surprise us." In this article from October 7th, 2022, like I said, is by Lawrence Reed, and it's available at fee.org. Of course, I'll link to the article in the show notes. And for those of you who don't remember or maybe didn't catch the episode, I recorded an episode with Lawrence Reed about his book, Are We Good Enough for Liberty? And of course, I'll link to that in the show notes as well. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that if you haven't already, or listen to it again, because there are some wonderful lessons, I think, in that podcast and in that book. But this article I'm going to share with you because my wife and I, we just had our first child in December, and education has been something that's been at the top of my mind for quite some time, and something that I've considered even before having children. But it's just disturbing to me that it's not painfully obvious how much the government schools are failing, and how much, no matter how much money we throw at them, it's not going to get better. And I've shared a chart by Daniel Mitchell, and I'll link to it in the show notes. The chart that shows the expenditures going toward government schools skyrocketing, and the results, or the math, science, reading skills of the students staying flat or falling, while the spending is skyrocketing. And this article points out that those more obvious things, but I think what's interesting about this is that it points out that it's not just an American problem. And the focus here, of course, is Israel, in comparison to the United States. But with that said, let's get into the article. Our schools, reports a knowledgeable observer, are producing ignoramuses. The average graduate, he explains, does not know how to read critically, write expressively, or debate intelligently and politely. Meantime, the unions are opposing huge proposed increases in beginning teacher salaries because, instead, they want higher pay for teachers with seniority, regardless of individual performance. Are we talking about America here? No, though Americans can sadly and credibly claim similar circumstances. What you just read comes from writer Amatz Asa-El in the July 29th to August 4th issue of the Jerusalem Post. In his article titled, How Can Jewish Schools Be Bad? The country whose schools he excoriates is Israel. For more than 2,000 years, a thirst for learning has been a core element of Jewish culture. Asa-El writes, so obsessed with education were the Jews that Jewish law decreed that a town that did not give its children a teacher must be excommunicated. And so unique did education make the Jews that a French monk noted in the 12th century that a Jew, however poor, if he had 10 sons, would put them all to letters, and not only his sons, but his daughters too. Education was a legacy, a quest, and a supreme value that went with the Jews wherever they wandered. That's how the penniless immigrants who proceeded from Europe's shtetls, Jewish enclaves, to the Lower East Side's sweatshops, produced by 1937 half of New York's doctors and 2/3 of its lawyers. One could reasonably assume that such a deep-rooted heritage would produce good public schools in a country defined by its Jewishness. But instead, says Asa-El, they are a disgrace. Not only are they academically bad, they also nurture indiscipline. He points out that it is most commonly reflected in students' total disregard for their teacher's very presence in the classroom. Moreover, In worst cases, this indiscipline breeds vandalism during field trips, not only in Israeli parks, but even in places like Birkenau, a notorious Nazi concentration camp, where Israeli students carved their names into barracks walls. The performance of American public schools, on average, is nothing to write home about either. Their disgraceful shortcomings are well known and hardly need to be recounted here. You can check the education section of Just Facts for the details. But guess what? I've heard the same complaint in almost all the 87 countries I've visited over the years. Even people who think their local public school is okay will decry the lousy and expensive outcomes in everybody else's public school. If a chain of private restaurants served bad food at high prices, it would be history in a hurry. Better eateries would spring up in their place, and customers would welcome such creative destruction as perfectly natural and beneficial. Even in education, we can find excellence. Private schools and homeschools are generally flourishing. These are the schools in which no parent or child is trapped by zip code. No unhappy customers are forced to patronize these options year after year. Distant bureaucracies and self-serving unions cannot bully their way into the classroom. Teachers are freer to get the job done. Fractious, distracting, intractable controversies are avoided because everybody pays for what they get and gets what they pay for, or they take a walk. Public schools are government schools. Their common denominator is politics. Who in their right mind would even think to suggest that to improve restaurants, we should assign people to eat at restaurants by geography or zip code? Would a bad restaurant improve if we threw more money at it, rewarded its staff according to seniority instead of merit, or put politicians in charge of its menu? The reality in Israeli schools proves that politics can take even an impressive cultural heritage and trash it in just a few generations. From Israel to America and lots of places in between, government is not the answer to problems in education. It is the paramount problem itself. Government politicizes education. It foists compulsory unionism on teachers. It rewards mediocrity and frustrates innovation and success. It stifles the very forces of choice, incentive, and accountability that produce progress in every other walk of life where they are employed. The answer is more freedom, not more politics and coercion. Why is such common sense so infuriatingly uncommon? Perhaps government conveniently forgot to teach it to us. So there you go. That's the end of the article there by Lawrence Reed. Again, the article is "The Root of Today's Worldwide Education Problem is Staring Us in the Face." And he says the common denominator is politics. But I wouldn't just say that it's politics. It's government itself. It's socialism rather than a free market in education. We talked about this a little bit in the episode with Michael Rechtenwald, episode 125, that the problem with socialism is that there is no profit and loss signal. Okay, if just like Lawrence Reed points out here about restaurants, if it's a bad restaurant, it becomes history almost instantaneously. Okay, profits are a signal that the business is doing well. It's providing a good product. It's providing what people want. Losses are a signal that it's not a good business. It's not providing what people want or need. And here, the education system, the government schools themselves operate without that profit and loss mechanism. They are a product of a socialist design, a socialist system. And without it, you get skyrocketing costs and terrible outcomes. Okay. And that's exactly what we see, not only, as Lawrence Reed says, in America, but worldwide. And I think that when you see people take the power, when you see families take the power, take the initiative rather, of education into their own hands, and they homeschool or they send their children to a private school, the outcomes are almost always better. And of course, there are exceptions. But the other thing here is that you don't just have bad outcomes in reading, writing, math, and science. Sending a coercive school system and sending a child into that government school also plays a huge role in tearing apart the fabric of our country, and that's the family. Thousands, tens of thousands of hours are spent in a school, a child away from their mother, away from their father, and then they're saddled with homework when they get home to distract them further from their family, further from their siblings, further from their mother and father. And so by the time that the child has spent just a few years in school, that relationship has already been damaged, has already been put by the wayside in some cases. Now, you can maintain a relationship, but it's very difficult and takes a great deal of effort in that small amount of time that's left over. So it's not just about the education here. It's about the fabric of society and the harm that the government schools cause, that compulsory schooling causes to the family. And he alludes to this a little bit, Lawrence Reed does here, when he talks about the indiscipline of the Israeli students, with the example of the vandalism at the concentration camp, Birkenau. And I think that Jonathan and Adriana Prescott do a good job talking about this as well in their book, Kids Don't Need School, which I discussed with them last year. I don't remember exactly when it was, but I'll link to that in the show notes as well. That this is not just about education. Of course, the opportunities for the child to flourish, to pursue their own interests, to pursue their own talents and gifts are much easier to pursue when they're homeschooled. But they also talk about these other secondary, maybe some would consider primary benefits. I think many would, in fact, and that is building a strong family, building a legacy. And I think that when people see that, when people escape the system, it's hard to look back. And we need more people to escape the system. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope it gave you some food for thought. Of course, if you did like it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share it with your friends and family to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and all of the most popular podcast streaming platforms. It's also you can also follow me on X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.